After all I've done for you, this is how you repay me? I said, my voice as dry as the desert wind. She flinched. Not much, just a flicker in her eyes like a coyote caught in a truck's high beams. I stood by the doorway, hands loose at my sides, not needing to fill the silence. The truth was sitting between us, heavy as the dust settling in after a storm. My name is Peter Graham, 58 years old. Spent most of my life out here in Red Mesa, Arizona. I make my living guiding people through places they've got no business being in, desert tourists, lost hikers, corporate types looking for some bullshit spiritual journey. The land doesn't care who you are. You either respect it or it eats you alive. I learned that from Tomas White Owl, the man who taught me everything worth knowing about this place. He's gone now, but his ranch still stands, and I look after it like he asked me to before he died. It's my home. Or at least it was. Kendall shifted her weight, arms wrapped tight around herself like she could make herself small enough to disappear. She used to have a presence back when we first met. Sharp, thoughtful, the kind of woman who didn't waste words. Now she looked worn down, like the wind had sanded her smooth over the years. She started, then stopped. No excuse ready. No clever lie. That told me all I needed to know. I walked past her, slow, steady, like I had all the time in the world. Picked up a glass off the counter, turned it in my hand. How long? She swallowed hard. Peter, how long? A shaky breath. A few months. A few months. I let that sit in my gut for a second. Couldn't say I was surprised. I'd felt it in the little things, the way she pulled away when I put a hand on her back, the way she lingered a little too long in the driveway before coming inside. The way her eyes, once sharp and knowing, stopped meeting mine. You love him. My voice was flat, like I was asking if we were out of milk. She hesitated. That was enough of an answer. I exhaled through my nose, placed the glass back on the counter, exact same spot I'd picked it up from. A habit from years in the desert, leave things as you found them. I looked at her then, really looked. The same woman who used to wait up for me when I got back from an expedition, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on the table. The woman who used to sit on the porch beside me, saying nothing at all because nothing needed to be said. Now she couldn't even hold my gaze. Who? I asked. She flinched again, and that's when I knew. She thought she could keep him out of it, that protecting his name might soften the blow. I took a step forward, slow and deliberate. Who? She licked her lips, hesitant. Daniel. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then it did. The tattoo shop in Tucson. The guy I'd seen her mention in passing, some artist she thought was interesting. I never paid him much mind, just another drifter, another kid pretending he had life figured out. I nodded just once. Right? Silence stretched out between us. She wasn't crying. I wasn't yelling. There was no scene, no drama. Just the weight of what she'd done hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't broken yet. Finally she spoke, voice small. I didn't mean for it to happen. I let out a slow breath. You did it though. She closed her eyes. I felt invisible, Peter. Invisible. That word sat wrong with me. Like I was the one who'd stopped seeing her. Like I hadn't spent years making sure we had a good life, that the bills were paid, that she never had to go without. I nodded again, slower this time. Guess that's that then? She blinked. What does that mean? It means I heard all I need to. I reached for my keys on the counter, the same spot they always were. Muscle memory. You got a choice to make, Kendall. Either you fix what's broken, or you go be with your artist. I turned for the door, not looking back. But you don't get both. The screen door creaked as I stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool, dry, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. I stood there for a second, listening. She didn't follow me. That told me everything I needed to know. I drove out to Tomas White Owl's ranch, headlights cutting through the desert night. The road was familiar, carved into my bones after years of taking it home. But tonight, it didn't feel like home. Just another place I'd have to reckon with. I rolled down the window, let the dry wind rush in, filling the cab with the scent of dust and sagebrush. The desert had a way of stripping things down to what they really were. No room for pretending out here. I pulled up to the house, killed the engine, and sat there in the dark. The place was quiet, just the soft rustling of mesquite trees and the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. Tomas used to say the desert didn't care about your troubles, but it would always listen. Inside, I set my hat on the hook by the door, kicked off my boots, and poured a drink. Whiskey, neat. Just enough to take the edge off. The place was as I left it, simple, solid. A few framed photos on the shelf, old Navajo rugs on the wood floors, a rifle propped against the doorway like always. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, turning the glass in my hand. The anger wasn't hot. It was cold, settled deep, like a slow-burning coal that wasn't going out anytime soon. I'd spent my life doing things the right way. Working, providing, building something worth keeping. And she'd thrown it away for what? I took another sip, let it burn on the way down. I'd seen men fall apart over a woman. Seen them drink themselves stupid, beg, grovel, make fools of themselves. That wasn't going to be me. But I wasn't going to just let this slide either. The next morning I got up before the sun, same as always. Made coffee strong enough to scrape the rust off an engine, stepped out onto the porch and watched the first light spill over the horizon. The desert stretched out before me, endless and unmoved. It had seen worse than this. By mid-morning I was in town. Red Mesa was small, the kind of place where people noticed things. Where whispers moved faster than the wind. I knew what was coming. The glances. The sudden silence when I walked into the Cactus Spur Saloon for my usual breakfast. "Peter," said Sam Jenkins, the bartender. He was built like an old workhorse, broad, solid, with a face that looked like it had taken a few too many punches. "You want the usual?" "Yeah." I sat at the counter. A couple of ranch hands were nursing beers down at the other end, trying to act like they weren't listening. "You hear about that sign outside of Tucson?" Sam asked, sliding a mug of coffee in front of me. I took a sip. "I did." He smirked. "Figured that was you." I didn't answer. Didn't need to. Word had gotten out fast. The billboard was sitting right off the highway in plain sight of Daniel Nash's tattoo shop. Nothing flashy, just a stark white background with bold, black letters. Some men build. Some men destroy. Some men steal. A cheater is all three. No names. No need. People knew. Sam chuckled under his breath. Subtle. Figured I'd let the truth do the talking. He nodded, approving. "So what's next?" I took another sip of coffee. "Haven't decided." That wasn't true. I'd already made up my mind. By noon I was standing in front of Kendall's parents' house. Miriam and Hank Davis were good people. Old school, church-going, proud of their family name. I knocked once, waited. Miriam answered, her face pinched with concern. "Peter." "Miriam." I tipped my hat. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Hank's in the den." I found him in his recliner, reading the newspaper. He looked up, eyes sharp. "Something wrong, Peter?" "Yeah," I said. "Figured you'd want to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else." His jaw tightened. "Go on." I laid it out plain, no embellishment. Just the facts. The way Kendall had been sneaking around. The motel receipts. The tattoo artist. Miriam sank onto the couch, one hand over her mouth. Hank didn't say a word, just sat there, gripping the armrests like he was keeping himself from breaking something. Finally he exhaled. "I don't understand." I shrugged. "Neither do I." Miriam blinked rapidly, then looked at me. What are you going to do?" "Divorce." Hank nodded, slow. "Good." Miriam wiped at her eyes. I don't know what to say." I looked at her, steady. "You don't have to say anything. Just figured you should know." I left them sitting there, took the long way home. Stopped at the post office, picked up a package I'd been waiting on, a thick manila envelope from my lawyer. Papers inside. By the time I got back to the ranch, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky that deep burnt orange that only happens in the desert. I sat on the porch, papers in one hand, a pen in the other. This was it. The line in the sand. I signed. By the time the papers were filed, word had spread like wildfire through Red Mesa. Small towns don't keep secrets, not the kind that come with motel receipts and quiet confessions. People talked in whispers at the hardware store, the diner, the church parking lot. Some looked at me with pity, others with a quiet nod of respect. Either way, I wasn't the one they were whispering about. Kendall had gone to stay with her sister in Tucson. I hadn't asked. Didn't need to. She'd packed up a few bags, left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and walked out without another word. I didn't stop her. If she wanted out, she had it. That should have been the end of it. Let her go, let the dust settle. But I don't leave things unfinished. I was parked outside La Katrina Tattoo, Daniel Nash's shop, watching the afternoon traffic roll by. Tucson was busier than Red Mesa, but still had that desert grit to it, old buildings, cracked pavement, sun-faded signs that hadn't been replaced in years. The shop was tucked between a pawn store and a liquor store, the kind of place that attracted drifters and regret. I stepped inside. The air smelled like ink and antiseptic, a faint hum of a tattoo gun coming from the back. A girl at the front desk barely glanced up from her phone. "You got an appointment?" "No." She finally looked up. Whatever she saw made her straighten. "You need something?" "I need a word with Daniel." She hesitated. "He's busy." "I'll wait." A few minutes passed before he came out, wiping his hands with a stained rag. Daniel Nash. Mid-30s, wiry, long dark hair tied back, arms covered in ink. His eyes flicked up, met mine, and just for a second he hesitated. He knew who I was. I let the silence stretch. Finally he forced a smirk. "What can I do for you?" I took my time answering. Let him feel the weight of me standing there. "I don't think we got properly introduced." His smirk twitched. "Look, man, save it." My voice was steady, low. "I don't care what she told you, don't care what excuses you got lined up. I came here to tell you how this is gonna go." He bristled. "I don't owe you anything." I took a step forward, slow. "You owe me your absence." His mouth opened, then closed. His fingers curled around the rag in his hands. "You're done," I said. "You leave her alone. No calls, no messages, no running into her by accident." I tilted my head. "I know what kind of man you are. You prey on women looking for a way out, tell them what they want to hear. You think it makes you special." I shook my head. "You're a cheap escape. That's all." His face darkened. "She's not your property, old man." That made me smile. Just a little. "You think this is about her?" I leaned in just enough to drop my voice. "This is about you learning that actions have consequences. You can either take what's coming or you can get the hell out of my way." His jaw clenched. He was younger, probably faster, but he wasn't a fighter. Not really. He was the kind of man who only stood his ground when he thought there was no real risk. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Fine," he muttered. I clapped him on the shoulder just hard enough to make him flinch. Smart choice. As I turned to leave, I caught his reflection in the mirror behind the counter. He wasn't smirking anymore. Back in Red Mesa, I stopped by the Cactus Spur Saloon. The place was half full, the usual crowd. Ranch hands, retirees, a couple of younger guys shooting pool in the back. Sam Jenkins was behind the bar, wiping down a glass. He raised an eyebrow when he saw me. "Good trip." I sat down, rolling my shoulders. "Productive?" He set a whiskey in front of me without asking. "You do what you needed to?" I took a sip. He knows where he stands. Sam smirked. "And where's that?" I set the glass down. "Somewhere far from me." He chuckled. "Fair enough." Across the bar, Maria Cortez, Daniel's ex, was working her shift. She caught my eye and gave me a small nod, silent acknowledgement. She'd been collateral damage in all this, but she wasn't the type to let it break her. I finished my drink, left a bill on the counter, and walked out into the cooling desert air. The sun was dipping low, throwing long shadows across the road. One step at a time, I was taking back what was mine. I sat on the porch that night, boots up on the railing, a cigar between my fingers. The desert stretched out before me, quiet, endless. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, their calls blending with the rustle of mesquite trees in the wind. The sky was clear, stars sharp as cut glass. Kendall had called once since she left. I let it ring. She didn't leave a message. The next morning, I drove into town. First stop was Jim Rollins' law office, a cramped little space next to the post office, cluttered with old books and paperwork stacked 2 feet high. Jim had been handling divorces longer than I'd been alive. He looked up when I walked in, eyes already knowing. "Figured I'd be seeing you." I dropped into the chair across from his desk, pulled a folded paper from my jacket and slid it across to him. "I want this done clean. No back and forth, no drawn-out fights. She gets nothing but what she brought into the marriage." Jim adjusted his glasses, skimmed the paper, then nodded. "She contesting it?" "Haven't given her the chance." He smirked. "Cold, Peter. Efficient." He scribbled something down, then leaned back. "You gonna be all right?" "I always am." I left him to it and walked down to the hardware store where Earl Xavier was stacking bags of feed near the entrance. Earl was built like a brick wall, hands like tree trunks. He'd been running the store for as long as I could remember. He glanced up, then wiped his hands on his apron. "Peter." "Earl." I picked up a roll of fencing wire, tossed it onto the counter. "Need to reinforce the back pasture. Coyotes been bad? Just want to keep out anything that doesn't belong." He rang it up, sliding the receipt across the counter. "Heard about the billboard." I counted out cash, slid it back. "Did you?" He chuckled. "Damn near half the county has." "Good." I took my things and walked out. Stopped for gas. Grabbed a coffee from the station. Nodded to a couple of old-timers sitting on the bench outside. They nodded back. No words needed. By noon, I was back at the ranch, working. Sweat poured down my back as I hammered posts into the hard-packed earth. The sun was ruthless, but I welcomed it. There was something honest about work like this. Didn't lie, didn't cheat. It gave back exactly what you put in. I was halfway through when I heard tires on gravel. I turned, wiping sweat from my forehead as a car rolled up the drive. Kendall. She stepped out slow, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to be here. She was thinner than the last time I saw her, hair pulled back, eyes tired. She folded her arms, shifting on her feet. I didn't say anything, just waited. Finally, she sighed. I got the papers. I nodded once. Good. She glanced around, like she was seeing the place for the first time. It looks different. Always did the work myself, I said. Guess you never noticed. She flinched at that but didn't argue. A long silence stretched between us. She looked down, took a breath. I don't expect forgiveness. Good. I don't give it out for free. She swallowed hard, then squared her shoulders. I just wanted to say, I didn't mean to hurt you. I met her eyes, steady. You didn't hurt me, Kendall. You lost me. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Whatever she thought she was walking into, she hadn't expected that. I nodded toward the car. You should go. She hesitated, then turned. Got in. Sat there for a second, hands on the wheel before pulling away. I watched the dust settle long after she was gone. Then I turned back to the fence and got back to work. The weeks rolled by, one sunrise bleeding into the next. I worked the land, let the sweat wash out whatever was left of the past. The fence went up, strong and steady. I patched up the barn roof, fixed the old water pump out by the well. Simple things, things that didn't ask questions or give you excuses. I slept well, ate what I needed, didn't think much beyond what had to get done. That was the way of the desert. Stay busy, stay sharp, or it swallows you whole. One evening, I was closing up the barn when I heard an engine approaching. Not Kendall this time. The sound was rougher, older. A truck, not a car. The headlights cut through the dust, and when it finally rolled to a stop, the door creaked open, and Caleb Brown stepped out. Skinny kid, early 20s, clothes too big for him, carrying everything he owned in a beat-up canvas duffel. He ran a hand through his shaggy brown hair and gave me a nod, shifting on his feet like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. Hey, Peter. I leaned against the barn door, arms crossed. What the hell are you doing here? He glanced at the house, then back at me. Just needed a place for a while. Caleb had been a regular at the Cactus Spur, a kid with more ambition than direction. Grew up in Red Mesa, but didn't have much holding him here. His old man was a drunk, his mother long gone. He'd always talked about getting out, making something of himself, but life had a way of keeping people stuck. I let the silence stretch. Finally, I jerked my head toward the porch. You eat. He hesitated, then shook his head. Then quit standing there looking sorry for yourself. Inside, I pulled a couple of steaks from the fridge, threw them on the cast iron skillet. He sat at the kitchen table, drumming his fingers against the wood, eyes darting around like he was afraid to get comfortable. Thought you were heading to California, I said. He shrugged. Didn't work out. Didn't work out? Or you didn't try hard enough? He let out a humorless chuckle. Same difference. I plated the food, set one in front of him, then sat down across the table. He picked up his fork, hesitated. You sure about this? I took a bite, chewed. You showed up. That means something. But if you're gonna stay here, you work. No free rides. He nodded quickly. Yeah, of course. Anything you need. I watched him a second longer, then let it drop. We ate in silence. The only sound the faint hum of the cicadas outside. When we were done, I stood, grabbed a spare set of blankets from the closet, and tossed them his way. Couch is yours. We start early. He caught them midair, nodding. Got it. I turned for my room, pausing in the doorway. Don't screw this up, Caleb. He exhaled, something like relief in his face. I won't. The next morning I woke at dawn, same as always. Caleb was already up, sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, looking out over the land. Didn't figure you for a morning person, I said, stepping outside. He smirked. Didn't figure you for someone who lets strays stay the night. I grunted, taking a sip from my own mug. The sun was just creeping over the horizon, turning the sky that deep amber color you only get out here. You stick around, I said, you'll learn how to take care of yourself. He nodded, slow. That's the plan. I didn't say anything more. Just stood there, letting the desert wake up around us, knowing that some things didn't need to be rushed. Caleb stuck around longer than I expected. Long enough to prove he wasn't just looking for a place to crash. He took to the work fast, quicker than I thought he would. Didn't complain, didn't slack off. He'd spend mornings fixing fences, afternoons hauling supplies from town, and nights sitting on the porch rolling a cigarette he never lit. Said it gave him something to do with his hands. One night, after we finished setting up a new water trough in the east pasture, we sat on the porch, boots kicked up, a bottle of beer sweating between my fingers. He cracked his knuckles, watching the last of the daylight bleed into the horizon. You ever think about leaving, Peter? I let out a slow breath, I still on the land stretching out in front of us. I left plenty of times. Just never stayed gone. He nodded like he understood, but I wasn't sure he did. Not yet. I used to think if I could just get out of Red Mesa, I'd be somebody, he said. Like the place was what was holding me back. It wasn't. He smirked. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. We sat in silence for a bit. Crickets started up, the occasional rustle of a night breeze through the brush. He shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest. You ever gonna start over? I mean, after everything. He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. I took a sip of my beer, let the quiet settle. Already did. A week later, I found myself in Santa Fe, standing in front of a painting. A desert scene, simple but striking. The way the light hit the sand, the brush strokes that gave movement to something still. It was the first time I'd seen the desert the way I felt it, alive, breathing, something beyond just dirt and sky. That one's a favorite, a voice said behind me. I turned to see a woman standing there, arms crossed, and easy confidence about her. Eleanor Ford. The artist. Mid-50s, sharp eyes, paint under her nails like she just stepped away from a canvas. You the one who painted it? I asked. She nodded. Guilty. I glanced back at the painting. You get it right. She tilted her head. Not many people see it like that. Not many people know what they're looking at. She studied me for a second, then smirked. You live out there? All my life. Her eyes flicked over my weathered boots, the dust on my sleeves, like she was putting the pieces together. Makes sense. I looked back at the painting. You ever been out there, or just paint from pictures? I go when I can. She shrugged. But I know I don't belong to it. Just borrowing the image. That earned her a nod. She understood more than most. She glanced at me again, something curious in her expression. You should come by the gallery opening tomorrow. It's mostly tourists, but there's free whiskey. I almost laughed. Almost? Might be worth a look. She smiled and something about it felt real. Good. Don't be late. I showed up the next night, mostly to see if the whiskey was any good. It was. The gallery was full of the kind of people who talked more than they listened, who wore scarves even when it wasn't cold, but Eleanor wasn't like that. She found me near the back, handed me a drink, and leaned against the wall like we'd known each other longer than a day. You don't strike me as an art collector, she said. Not much of one. She sipped her drink. So what brought you? I looked at the painting again, the one that had caught my eye. Guess I just like seeing the truth in things. She smiled, small but knowing. Me too. The night went on. We talked. Nothing deep, nothing forced. Just two people with a quiet understanding, neither one in a hurry to fill the silence. At the end of the night, she handed me a business card, but I didn't take it. Instead, I met her eyes and said, I'll see you around. She nodded. I hope so. I left before the crowd thinned out, walked out into the cool night air. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a man looking over his shoulder. Back at the ranch, Caleb was still up, sitting on the porch, flipping a pocket knife open and closed. He glanced up when I stepped onto the porch. Good trip? He asked. I sat down, stretched my legs out. Productive? He smirked. That what you call it? I just took a sip of my drink, let the desert air fill my lungs. Some things you don't need to explain. The days stretched out steady as the horizon. Work got done, sun came up, sun went down. The land didn't give a damn about what had happened before, and I liked that about it. Kept me grounded. Caleb was still around, proving himself more useful by the day. The kid had a way with fixing things, engines, fences, irrigation lines. I wasn't the kind of man to hand out praise, but I let him know when a job was done right. That was enough. One evening, we were stacking feed in the barn when he leaned against a post and wiped the sweat off his face with his sleeve. Ran into Kendall in town, he said, casual, but watching for my reaction. I tossed another bale onto the stack. That right? He nodded. She looked rough. I picked up the last bale, set it down slow. That's her business. Didn't look like she was doing so hot, he said. Heard she moved back in with her sister. Daniel took off a while back. Guess he wasn't in it for the long haul. I pulled my gloves off, dusted my hands off on my jeans. A man like that never is. Caleb let out a short laugh, but there wasn't much humor in it. Guess not. We didn't say much after that. No need to. Later that night, I sat on the porch, the desert stretching out in front of me. Same as always. The air was cooler now, the kind of night that settled in your bones. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain, though the sky was still clear. The desert had a way of warning you before the storm hit. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. A text from Eleanor. Back in town next week. Dinner. I stared at the screen for a second, then typed back, sounds good. No hesitation. No overthinking. Just a decision made like any other. I lit a cigar, took a slow drag, let the smoke curl into the night air. Caleb stepped outside, leaned against the railing, flipping that damn pocketknife open and closed. You ever regret not fighting harder for her? I exhaled, watching the ember glow in the dark. You don't fight for someone who's already lost. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. We sat there for a while, listening to the desert. The land had been here long before me, and it'd be here long after. That kind of thing put everything into perspective. I took one last drag, flicked the cigar into the dirt, and stood up, stretching out the stiffness in my back. Come on, I said, heading for the barn. We've got work to do in the morning. Life goes on.